The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Shimmering skyscrapers, modest homes, inspiring and uninspiring public places. Architecture shapes the space we occupy. All week we'll learn how with architects Eladia Smoke, Geishigaba Week, Carol Phillips, Marianne McKenna, and Don Schmitt. Tonight, what makes a good building? That's next on The Agenda in the Summer. This might be weird to hear, but I think one of my favorite spaces anywhere is the Eaton Center. I love how when you walk in, there's so much light, and I love the feeling that it gives me. But I don't know if it's kind of nostalgia, because when I was a teenager, that was the space that I knew that if I went to the mall, no one would really bother me, that I could actually belong. Frank Lloyd Wright has this great quote. He said, "The mission of an architect is to help people understand how to make life more beautiful." Marianne, what is architecture for, in your view?
Well, I think following on your comment, I would say architecture is really for people. It's to enhance people's lives. It's to help them to build community. It's to give them a foundation for their own self-expression, self-actualization. And I think in every way, every project has that potential, is really to change lives.
And this is a feeling, right?
It's the feeling, but it has, I mean, architecture is an art and a science, and it creates a platform. You know, as you said, to the mall, you were there to really just to be there, and to sort of see what current trends were, to see other people of your same age group, to see the world, to experience an incredible cross-section. I think our architecture has great purpose also in that it creates platforms for people to learn and people to experience their own development. So in the much of the academic work that we do is for research and for science and for people's, the enhancement of endeavors.
And their lives, right? Carol, what do you think?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that it is an art and a science, and I think we've all heard that architecture swallows other arts. It's kind of the mother of all arts. And so I think it has the dimensions to not only influence us as individuals, but influence us as a collective. And I think with that comes tremendous responsibility. Tremendous responsibility to make sure the spaces we make are inclusive and actually reflect a community. And I think that is part of what we do, is not only affirm our relationship with a place, a city, a community, but with each other. And I think that is the great potential of architecture, is to actually impact us on very personal levels. And I love that you mentioned, you said it may sound inappropriate, that the Eaton Center, but that's it. It has to do with how we relate, how we feel personally, and the self really is a point of departure to the collective. So your personal experiences matter, because chances are they're the same as someone else's. And space and how we frame that experience, how we frame nature, how we frame our urban environments as well, this is all part of how we see each other in a place and how we see each other as a collective. And architecture has the potential and the responsibility to frame that in an inclusive way.
And what about you, Eladia?
At its most basic, architecture is an artificial habitat that we create. And it mediates between the body and the environment. But because it encloses our activities, it also defines them. So architecture creates spaces for gathering and for intersecting between human life and the life systems that surround us. It also places value on what kinds of activity we want to see in a space.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when we create a place, that place is meant for a particular kind of activity. So say, for example, if we're meeting in a rectangular room, it becomes kind of uncomfortable to meet in a circle in that room, for example. So I call my architectural practice always inserting circles into squares. So that's what I end up doing because, that circle is so meaningful to how we gather. It represents equity. It represents, bringing everything that you can to that circle. And that's something that doesn't always fit into many of the environments we've created because those environments sort of are tessellated rectangles. And so by its nature, architecture reflects the value placed on the type of activity it's meant for. It also delineates what's possible to do in that space, what's encouraged and feels comfortable in that space.
Yeah, Don?
There's been mention of architecture as an art, but it's a very social art. It's an art that if we execute well, we shape community and we support community, whether it's a lab or a performing arts center or a gallery or a classroom or a house. We're really shaping a community space. And as I say, if we get it right, it makes the life of that community stronger. It supports it in the best way possible. You mentioned the Eaton Center. I mean, it's really community. It's civic community. It's people gathering in the city under light. We love to be in natural light, ideally outside, but natural light inside. The character of that space, your ability to kind of be very much alone in that space or observe social gatherings, decide whether you're going to join or whether you're going to stick to yourself or whether it's just groups of 2 or groups of 20. Calibrating those kind of gatherings in the community is what architecture has enormous potential to do. We don't, in many spaces that we build, we don't follow through far enough in making communities better through the configuration of space. But when we get it right, we can really make those communities sing.
I think you also have to add that the definition that you've given is an interior space. And I think that we more and more think about spaces as connecting to the outside. So I would say it's for people and it's for the planet. So you pick Eaton Center, I think that could have its own whole show because it's a space that at the time deprived the street, still does in a way. So I think when I think of architecture, I think about how it can open out to place, how it can enhance. It's inside out and it's outside in. So with that proviso, it's a wonderful image. But an architect always goes back and thinks, what's the bigger question here? How does that particular piece of architecture, how did it redefine the city? And, we say every building implies a city. So when you look at any piece of architecture, you have to think, how does this particular building impact the environment in which it is about to transform?
Yeah, I completely agree with that because, you talk about the enclosure of space, but the shell of that inflects the exterior space. And so whether that's in an urban context or embedded in nature, there is an impact to what we do. And that impact is becoming more and more, we're more and more aware of our impact. When we shape the environment, we cannot now in the climate emergency not think of every aspect of what we do as having impact to the planet. And so we do that on small scales and at larger scales. And I think the urban environment is one where we can see exactly how we shape the corollary space that's right outside the building. And what is the threshold? It's a really exciting moment to think about the facade. And what is the threshold between interior and exterior, and how do you navigate that? And how do we, in a way, connect back to that exterior environment?
As architects, when you're making these decisions, when you are thinking about the thing that you want to say, I guess it's a great responsibility. Do you feel that responsibility, Eladia?
Yes, architecture is a manifestation in the physical realm of what humans believe we're all about. So how we think of ourselves in the wider world of other living systems, the cosmos. And so when you're making an architectural space, it's very important, I think, to listen to the people who are going to use that space and do your best to distill what you hear from them into an expression that makes sense for them, that carries the meanings that they hold most dear. I think in the past, architecture felt that it was an object in a field. So if you look at Beaux-Arts buildings, there's a rusticated, very rough, very high kind of division layer from the street. So we love these architectures because they're very grand. They feel
imposing
grounded.
in a way, kind of.
Yeah, sort of like they recall, principles that came to us from, the old world and so forth. And so that sort of pattern made sense for a certain era in time. And now, if you look at more contemporary architecture forms, they pay a lot of attention to edges. So, like how permeable the architecture is, like how it reaches out to the out of doors, how it intersects with landscape architecture and design, whether life thrives around the edges of the space you've created and inside. And I think that thriving of diverse life is sort of what we're focused on now in architecture.
Well, we've talked about how architecture is art and science. Is there a political element to architecture?
Oh yeah,
absolutely. But I think the issue of as an architect practicing, I could use the word obligation. You have an obligation to your community, to society, to kind of make place as well as you can, to make it sit as lightly as possible on the earth environmentally, as much as possible, to Carol's point, make the thresholds of accessibility as easy as possible. Eladia has mentioned, the Beaux-Arts. There are many kind of eras in architecture with the ability to impose and intimidate and exclude. And I think what we have an obligation to do now, and we understand better how to do now, is to include, to be transparent, to be inclusive, to be accessible, to welcome, and to kind of demystify, particularly institutions. Various institutions in society, have a kind of intimidation factor that is saying you're excluded. And I think we're in a moment where we're trying hard and exercising an obligation to overcome those exclusions and an obligation to kind of intensify the opportunities and the experience for people within the building, whether, in the myriad of different possibilities of space.
I think it's really values-based. Even when you talk about something, and I'm sorry to pick on the Eaton Center, but who drives the values? And when it's driven by commercial values, that can be challenging. So something like running the length of Yonge Street, but not being able to have entries directly into the Galleria inside, and that's driven by the values of the commercial values and the operational values of the retail commercial developer. You look at institutions; they're driven by the values. Educational values are driven quite differently. And I think one of the most fascinating parts of being an architect is being able to bring value-based arguments to your clients and actually being able to have those kinds of debates. And that's not always possible, but it's and it's probably a luxury if you get to do that. But I think we're in a time where the client base is open to these kinds of discussions, and it really changes the form of our architecture within the city, within nature. But I think purpose has become such a big opportunity for architects, the idea that we want to do projects that have purpose. And I think it is values-based, and our values have changed dramatically pre-COVID to post-COVID through, equity, diversity, inclusion, Indigenous ways of knowing, sustainability. We have so many new drivers that we need to think very, very carefully about anything that we do, and that, we have to be sure that our values, our vision aligns with our values.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would also say that the shifting of culture is it's a long historic line, and I think that if we start to look in terms of what you were mentioning, Eladia, about the activities within what we do, that maybe even the language needs to change. I mean, we do buildings that represent those who rule or those who serve, you know? And so if we start thinking about the social agenda, and you mentioned this, Dawn, the social responsibility, the social art of how we even approach the purpose of buildings. They're there to house, they're there to educate, they're even seats of government, they're ultimately buildings of service. And so if the language around how we speak about our work and how we speak to clients about it starts to help change the conversation, and architects do have agency to inflect those
You're
agendas.
not just taking orders from the client.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think we have a responsibility as well as some agency to try to change those agendas and to actually frame them in the societal values that we have been observing over time as we make, and a lot of us are involved in public buildings, that actually reflect those values.
And Eladia, when I said if it was political, you were like, oh yeah.
Well, I mean, architecture is the strategic deployment of capital, and it's by its nature directed by people who can bring capital to bear. So, you know, that is by its nature inherently political. So, we, I guess, are fortunate to practice in a socialism light market where 30% of the expended funds on built environment come from governmental sources. So it's not just the super rich who are defining what those environments are. We have the real honor to work with amazing people like Thunder Woman Healing Lodge and Patty Pettigrew and her whole crew. They are not like the privileged capital deployment folk of the world. But also, like, if you look at, and they're doing a site that has, a sweat lodge in the back in this highly urban postage-size site that they have to work with. They're managing to fit like a sweat lodge on a sacred fire there, and it's so inspiring.
20 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. Right?
No, that blows everybody's mind, right? So like being able to work on spaces like that is really dear to my heart. On the other end of the scale, I was really generously invited to advise on the most political site in the most political city we've got. So the Parliamentary Welcome Centre is now opening up Parliament in a new way to the public. So previously, you kind of had to go through this very, awkward method of entering Parliament. They're creating a new welcome approach. And so it's really interesting to see the moves they're making there, because they're including elements that have never been included in Parliament, like native species in the plantings and like non-formal gardens. And like, this is like, super revolutionary, because it was very extremely formalized in the past, and mostly exotic species. So it spoke very little about Canada and a lot to do about what Canada used to aspire to be, which is essentially some other place. So like when we talk about Canadians, that's diversity, that's our land, that's us, and our spaces need to reflect who we are in all of our glorious diversity. So I'm so pleased when client groups that you maybe wouldn't ever expect to ask these questions are now asking them, and it's such a treat to work with clients who see those as key project success factors, and we're able to, distill that down into a physical thing.
And Dawn, I'm going to say.
Well, I mean, to get at your question about the role of politics in architecture, it's present all the time, but to get at that question, I think in my view, architects have been very bad listeners for generations. They impose as much as listen to communities, and I think.
Why was that before?
Well, I think it had to do a lot with kind of values in society, the issues of power and capital that Eladia was speaking of. I mean, who controls the resources to make buildings, which cost, hundreds of thousands and millions and tens of millions of dollars? I mean, where is the capital controlled, and who controls that? I think the kind of issue of listening is a question of listening to communities. we're doing a very large housing project in Ottawa, entirely affordable housing, 500 units of housing, and meeting with the community and understanding the residents who are, currently part of the affordable housing communities in Ottawa. Understanding their priorities has led to an issue of making all of that to passive house standard. Passive house standard means basically wearing a kind of big, comfortable, warm coat, so it performs extremely well in terms of energy consumption. It's a very kind of respectable standard of environmentalism that was important to the residents. And then, how does the lobby work? How do children find secure places to play? How do laundries and how do social spaces connect with lobbies? What's possible in terms of interaction? All of those issues of making that kind of housing community come out of listening. And I think listening and understanding and being thoughtful about those opportunities, and then bringing those values to the design and using a kind of rigorous process of interaction with your client or the client's community to kind of understand, are you actually delivering the values that they have talked about, is, I think, a critical aspect of practice now.
We're going to talk more about that on tomorrow's show, on how you plan and how we build things. Okay. Eladia, you once described how architecture should also be regenerative. What did you mean by that?
Up until recently, architecture has been understood as the building, and then all the other things that aren't the building. And I think we're moving into a time of thinking about how we shape our environments that also includes other life systems. So when we create spaces, we're not just creating them for humans, we're creating them for all those other creatures, the plant life, the animal life, the entities of the air, water. We're creating places where life can thrive. All life can thrive, and we need to do that because we have discovered recently, scientists have been trying to tell us this, and Indigenous peoples have been trying to tell us this for probably decades, possibly hundreds of years, that when you do that, you create systems that are not resilient. So in order to create resilient systems that are sustainable and can continue life on this planet, human life on this planet, for the next 100 years, we've got to make spaces that are for everyone, for all living creatures, and that honor the fact that humans are one of the most dependent species on this planet. We depend on everything else for our life. And if you think about the air we breathe, that depends on plants making the oxygen for us and absorbing our carbon dioxide. And so if we're creating environments that are solely for human life, we won't survive. So we really have to change our thinking from a duality between human life and everything else to thinking that we are part of a family and that we have a kinship relationship with other creatures. And we have to honor those relationships more concretely, more architecturally.
And the earth.
Yeah.
And the earth.
Yeah. Yeah, because we're one organism, we're one continuous living creature, even though we feel like individuals and we have, our own little dance that we're doing. We really are part of one organism, and we have to honor all of the parts when we create space.
We've touched a little bit throughout the conversation about accessibility and spaces being for everybody. But if you live in the city of Toronto and you've tried to use a subway, and if you are in a wheelchair, or maybe you're a parent with a stroller, it's kind of shocking that only a few years ago, most of the subways did not have elevators. And even now, if the elevators work, that's a great day. So what is the difference between good architecture and good urban planning? I'm going to give it to you, Carol, and we've got like 2 minutes.
Well, I think good urban planning creates, first of all, an identity for a place. And this notion of accessibility is one where we're changing the conversation to say that we're going to accommodate these few issues, but to start to understand that making designs, cities, sidewalks, buildings more accessible actually makes them more accessible and better for everyone. So rather than sort of just creating exceptions to make a tolerance for a situation, when we design, it's like when we design buildings for a collective, if we also design for the individual in mind, then we've made it successful for everybody. And so once we make cities accessible for, and buildings accessible for those who have mobility issues, then we've actually made it better for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to shift that conversation to understand how we create that generosity in buildings that we create. But when you talk about the public realm and when you talk about city planning, I think part of that is actually putting a priority on the public spaces and public realms. And part of this is the fact that we have commodified architecture to such a degree that we talk about the square footage of houses, we talk about the square footage of a living unit, but the corollary social spaces that are required to make those communities successful are not necessarily given value or priority. And so successful urban planning sees value in the public realm, sees value in the space adjacent to the community that you've built, and sees that as an occasion to actually create value in our collective public experience. And so for me, successful urban planning goes beyond these issues of accessibility, but how we on a daily basis encounter each other in the public realm and how we create a sense of genius loci or sense of place that is really inherent and specific to the places we're building in. That's building a sense of community, and urban planning has that huge responsibility as well, beyond issues of transportation and all the other components that go into urban planning.
I think that's a great place to leave it because it will help us for our next segment to understand more about the building blocks of architecture and whether form or function is more important. Thank you so much. I've already learned so much already in this last half hour. Appreciate it. Our guests all this week are Eladia Smoke, Gay Shigaba Week, Principal Architect of Smoke Architecture. Carol Phillips, Design Leader and Partner at Moriyama Tashima Architects. Marianne McKenna, Founding Partner of KPMB Architects. And Dawn Schmitt, Principal of Diamond Schmitt Architects.
The agenda in the summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.